what you thought of the novel or to field any of the questions that you might have. So I'll try and keep my introductory remarks quite brief. So just to put the book into some kind of context, The Quaker is my third novel. My first two novels, All the Colours of the Town and Where the Dead Men Go, these novels were political thrillers with a contemporary setting featuring the investigative journalist Jerry Conway as the protagonist. And I conceived this, the Conway books, as a trilogy, but I then got a little bit bored with my central character. And so I've kind of left it hanging as a two-book trilogy and sort of moved on to different things. So the novel that I'm speaking about today, The Quaker, is, I suppose, a historical thriller set in Glasgow in 1969, around the time of the real-life Bible John murders. And it's a sort of loose fictionalisation of those murders. The scenario is that it's Glasgow in 1969. My protagonist is D.I. Duncan McCormick, who, as it happens, is a gay Catholic Highland Flying Squad detective, and he's tasked with reviewing the faltering investigation into a serial killer in Glasgow. So 3 murders have been committed. There hasn't been a murder in a number of months, and the top brass are looking to wind down the investigation. And because it's such a high-profile case, they can't simply close it down. They need to go through a procedure, and this is where Duncan McCormick comes in. But what happens is that just as he finishes writing his report, a 4th murder takes place, and suddenly, instead of winding the investigation down, McCormick is suddenly part of the investigative team and has to work alongside colleagues who, up until now, have regarded him as a bit of a turncoat, a grass, if you like. That's one strand of the plot. A second strand features a character called Alex Payton, who is, in the vernacular of my hometown, what we would call a peterman, what you would probably call a safe blower, a jugger. And this character, Alex Payton, is based in London, and he returns to Glasgow to conduct a major heist in the city. And as you might imagine, those two plot lines intersect as the novel progresses. I might talk a bit about the historical background to the book, because, as I say, it's based on a real-life historical series of crimes, the so-called Bible John murders. And to someone who grew up in the west of Scotland in the 1970s and 80s, as I did, the words Bible John had quite a special resonance. You might overhear your parents talking in guarded voices about Bible John, or you might overhear bigger kids in the playground discussing these murders that took place in the big bad city across the Fenwick Moor 20 miles away. The murders took place in Glasgow in 1968 and 1969. There were 3 murders. In each case, the victim was picked up in the Barrowland Ballroom, which is quite a rough dance hall in the east end of the city. They were then raped, strangled, and dumped within a few hundred yards of their homes. And the 3 victims lived in very different quarters of the city. Battlefield in the south side, out east in Bridgeton, and out west in Scotstoun. And there was no direct connection between the victims, although they shared a physical type. They were all brunettes and petite. They all had young children. 2 of them were separated or divorced from their husbands, and a third had a husband who was with the services. And there was a kind of quasi-Presbyterian moralism in much of the commentary on these murders. You know, what were these women doing out gallivanting when they had kiddies at home, as if there was some kind of grim Calvinist karma at work in their deaths. The killer was never caught, and this was quite surprising because the police knew a great deal about Bible John. The sister of the 3rd victim shared, well, in fact, spent an evening in Bible John's company in the Barrowland Ballroom and then shared a taxi with him on the way back to Scotstoun in the west end of the city. So she was able to give the police quite a detailed description of the killer. So they knew a great deal about him. He was tall, he had fair reddish hair, worn unfashionably short, he was well spoken, he dressed smartly in a 3-button brown chalk stripe suit. He was scrupulously polite, he wore a regimental tie, a wristwatch with a thick leather strap, he had distinctive overlapping teeth. He also spoke in biblical cadences and ranted about dens of iniquity and women taken in adultery. And this was where the Bible John nickname was coined. So the police had a range of clues, and they blitzed those clues in what became the biggest investigation in the history of Scottish policing. And they got nowhere. The man had simply vanished from the face of the earth. Though he did live on as a kind of legend, a bogeyman. And I remember as a boy how the identikit photo and the artist's impression of Bible John would recur from time to time in the tabloid newspapers like the Daily Record. It was our equivalent of the ubiquitous sulky blonde mugshot of Myra Hindley that again would always be appearing in the News of the World or some of the other English tabloids. Our version of that was Bible John. So what made the case so resonant? Well, partly it was the fact that Bible John was never caught, but it was also, I think, that the case seemed to say something about Glasgow at that particular time. This was a time of great social upheaval in Glasgow. It was a time when the old tenement slums in the central city were being knocked down and redeveloped, and people were being decanted to massive peripheral housing schemes. So there are 4 housing schemes on the corners, 4 corners of Glasgow, and each of them have upwards of 60,000 residents. So it was a major sort of social transition, and in some sense it was a positive development that people were, leaving the slum conditions behind. But of course, the great thing about the slums was that in those tight-knit communities, everyone knew everyone else, and you had a sort of social network with your neighbours. When you moved to those large anonymous peripheral housing schemes, suddenly you had an indoor toilet and a washing machine, but you didn't know who your next door neighbour was. And this created the conditions of paranoia in which people began to believe that anyone could be Bible John. Their neighbour might be Bible John. The man standing beside you at the Horseshoe Bar drinking his whiskey might be Bible John. And it reached a sort of pitch of hysteria in 1969 in Glasgow that people were making citizens' arrests on individuals who in any way resembled the identikit photograph. So guys who were, between, let's say, the age of 30 and 45, who had short red hair and overlapping teeth, found themselves suddenly being whispered about and so on. And it reached the stage that the Chief Constable of Glasgow had to issue letters to these individuals saying, the bearer is certified as not being Bible John. So the case was, it was a case that I like to compare it in some ways to the John F. Kennedy assassination. It was kind of the West of Scotland equivalent of the JFK assassination. It's a case that people return to, that a number of writers have written about. So the journalist Andrew O'Hagan, who writes for the London Review of Books, wrote a terrific memoir called The Missing, which is a section devoted to Bible John. Similarly, Ian Rankin, in his breakout novel Black and Blue in 1997, features one of the strands in that novel relates to the Bible John killings. So it was something that I suppose I knew from an early age that it was something that I wanted to write about. And certainly when I began to write crime novels, it was a case that I was inevitably going to turn to. It did pose certain problems, though. I mean, I was conscious, for one thing, that the children of Bible John's victims were still alive. And I felt a bit uneasy about using their suffering for what was essentially an entertainment. So as a way around that, what I initially decided to do was, I mean, as I mentioned, the original Bible John murders, there were 3 historical murders. So what I thought I would do was invent a fictional 4th Bible John killing so that I could explore that killing and sort of use the historical resonance of the Bible John murders, but not tread on the toes, sort of ethically speaking, of the relatives of Bible John's victims. So I did it. I wrote about 20,000 words of the book, using the Bible John name, using the names of the real names of the victims. And then I had a kind of light bulb moment where I thought, instead of just inventing a fictional 4th murder, I could just change the name altogether and sort of have free rein to sort of treat the material how I wanted, and avoid some of the ethical, I suppose, queasiness that I felt surrounding it. So that's what I did, and it will be very clear. I mean, anyone who knows the Bible John story will instantly recognise that the Quaker is based on Bible John. But at the same time, it gave me a sense of ownership over the narrative. When I started with those first 20,000 words, I very often found that I was putting things into the book just because they happened, which is not, sort of speaking from a sort of writerly perspective, it's not a good enough reason to put something into a narrative. It has to be there for a sort of aesthetic or dramatic purpose. So just simply changing the name gave me a sense that instead of the material being in control of me, I was now in control of the material. I suppose the final sort of ethical dilemma that confronted me in the book was, in my previous 2 novels, the victims had all been male. And I faced in the Quaker the very familiar crime fiction scenario of the victims are all female. You know, you've got the violated corpse of the female victim, and then you've got the male detectives who have all the agency and go about solving the crime. And again, I was slightly morally ambivalent about that. So the way I chose to try and get round that was to basically do what Alice Sebold does in The Lovely Bones, or indeed Rosetta Allen, the great New Zealand novelist in Purgatory, and have some sections of the book written by the Quaker's victims, so essentially written by the dead women from beyond the grave. So that's probably, I think, enough of me banging on about the novel. As I say, I would be delighted to hear what you thought of the book, whether you liked it or not, don't hold back, and also just what questions you want to ask me about the novel.
Thanks, Liam. Thank you for that. We'll just wait for some questions to come flowing into the Q&A. So to our attendees, please feel free to pop your questions into the Q&A function, and they'll pop up on our screen here, and I'll be able to ask Liam the questions that you have burning in the back of your mind with regards to the Quaker. But I'll start off, Liam, if you don't mind. I wanted, how much easier do you think it would have been if you had totally written about something that had no place in history prior? If you had totally fabricated it all out of your mind and didn't have the background, do you think it would have been easier, or would it have posed you some problems?
I think that would have been more difficult, Donella. One of the things that attracted me to the Bible John story was precisely that, being able to use an existing crime, having the material already in existence that you simply have to shape into some kind of narrative. I think, one of the things I've come to recognise about my own practice as a crime writer is that I think I write better when I've got a clear sense of the structure of what I'm writing. And of course, if you're writing about an existing sort of series of murders in real life, you've kind of got your structure laid out. I remember discussing this with Val McDermott when she was here last year as visiting professor of crime fiction and Scottish studies at our centre, and asking her about her own process of structuring her novels, and saying, and she said that the Tony Hill and Carol Jordan novels, which are always based around a serial killer, almost wrote themselves, because he simply structured them according to the various murders that took place in the course of the novel. It gives you a sort of ready-made structure. And so when people ask, what is this obsession with serial killers in crime fiction? There's far more serial killers in crime fiction than there are committing crimes in real life. Well, that's kind of your answer.
Thank you, Liam. So we have some questions coming through now. The first question is, Charlotte has asked, how did you find writing from a female and gay male perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, I found it great fun, to be honest, writing from a perspective that wasn't my own. And I think in a way, as a writer, you're always looking for a way to bring the material to life. And I think it was André Gide who said that what you want to do as a novelist is write about someone who shares some of your background, but there's a sort of oblique angle to it. There's some element that you don't share. And so certainly with Duncan McCormick, the fact that he was gay and I'm not, posed certain challenges, but it was also more fun, and it brings the material to life, I think, when you've got to sort of use your imagination to a greater extent to try to inhabit a character. Writing from a female perspective is something I've done in some of the earlier books, and I do it in short bursts in this novel, and I absolutely, these were the chapters that I enjoyed writing the most. There was something about the liberation of writing from a female perspective that I just found hugely energizing. It's also quite scary, of course, and of course it's for female readers to judge whether I've made a good job, or whether my female characters, or me ventriloquizing a female voice, appears authentic. And I haven't quite had the courage yet to contemplate writing an entire novel from a female perspective. But yeah, sometimes it's just a break from writing about, dreary west of Scotland male detectives, I'm a kind of dreary west of Scotland male myself, so it's quite nice to kind of break out of that box from time to time.
Thanks, Liam. I'm just going to add a bit of an addition to this question that we've had from Charlotte. Did you have a particular person who helped you think about that female way of thinking, or did you have somebody who looked over what you had written and said, yeah, no, that's not how a female perspective would see that?
Well, I suppose I was about to say no, but I suppose my wife reads everything that I write before I send it off, and she very often manages to pick up errors of consistency, and because I write so slowly, I've often got a situation where in some of my earlier books where the character had young children, that in one scene they would be sort of 2 and 4, and the next scene they'd be like 7 and 9 or whatever. So she would pick all that stuff up. So I suppose she read over the chapters from a female perspective. And for the sort of gay, I mean, subsequently I had a great session with the Eden Gay Book Club, a group of gay men in Edinburgh who read the book. And I wished I'd done that in advance of writing the book, because they had some fantastic insights into what it was to be gay in that particular period. And they said, for instance, there's a gay character in the book who's picked up and he's got a condom in his pocket. I say, why has he got a condom in his pocket? This is pre-AIDS. You don't need a condom. So it was those little details that, would just have added that level of authenticity if I had perhaps spoken to more people in advance of writing the book.
Fantastic, thanks, Liam. We've got another question here from Pat, and he asked, Did you have a particular resolution that you wanted to achieve by writing the Quaker for yourself or for the reader?
I suppose one of the attractions, Pat, was to actually conclude the story. One of the frustrations very often of real life in relation to violent crime is that there is no closure. That we don't know who Bible John was. There have been some suggestions as to who he might be, but we haven't been able to definitively identify the killer of these three women. So, of course, that's one of the consolations of crime fiction, that in crime fiction, unlike in real life, you can bring that closure and that order. So I suppose that was one of the attractions of writing the novel, was to write that, essentially that Bible John story, but actually to bring the sort of satisfaction of a kind of narrative closure to that material.
Thank you. The next question comes from Melissa, and she asks, you write in quite a Glaswegian vernacular. Do you think some readers struggle with this?
Yes, I think that would be fair to say. I suppose it's always a tension between the demand of authenticity and the requirements of simply being understood by readers outside Glasgow. I also have quite a bit of Scottish Gaelic in the book, because Duncan McCormick is a Gaelic speaker, and there are scenes where he's interacting with other Gaelic speakers, and I don't provide a translation for that. So I suppose you have to regard some of the Glaswegian idiom in the same way. It's not there deliberately to make passages obscure. It's there really to give you a sense of the authentic flavour of the place. And I suppose because so much of Glaswegian culture and identity resides in how people use English, Scots vernacular in that city. So it would be very difficult to write a book that felt authentic to me without at least deploying some of that material. Where you find that coming out in stark relief is when the books get translated. So my French translator, who bizarrely I actually met in Dunedin, it's a chap called David Falkenberg, who was actually over with the Modern Languages department on some sort of fellowship. So I managed to meet him, my French translator, in Dunedin. But he actually has footnotes in the French edition of the book explaining certain terms, explaining some of the political background, some of the Northern Irish paramilitary references in the book. And it did occur to me that the original version might have benefited from a couple of footnotes too.
I'm sure some of your readers would have liked them, but others probably like sorting it out for themselves. Charlotte's asked another question, and she wants to know, did you find using the real life murders restricted you at all, or that you had to stay quite true to them out of respect?
I think I did try to stick quite closely to the facts of those cases as we have them. I suppose where I departed from them or amplified those details was precisely in those chapters from the perspective of the women. And in a way that's another reason why I had to fictionalize it and change the names, because I, of course, don't know what the interior life of the three women who actually died at the hands of Bible John might have been like. But it was important to me to try to give a sense of the interior life of the victims, because very often in crime fiction, the corpse is simply a plot point. You've got your dead woman, great, now we can go and investigate the murder. And that's, of course, problematical in all sorts of ways. So in some respects, the chapters from the perspective of the dead women are slightly gratuitous in the sense that they don't really advance the plot in any sense. And that, again, I think was partly why I enjoyed writing them. There was a sense of freedom that, when you're writing a thriller or a police procedural, you've got to keep quite a tight ship. Everything has to have a significance. You have to layer in your clues. And it's quite hard work just in terms of structuring a crime novel. So I think those chapters from the perspective of the murdered women were a little bit freer for that reason, that I could just simply write what I wanted in those chapters.
Great, thank you. Questions are still coming in, which is great to see. So please just feel free to add them to the Q&A. We have one from a participant in Singapore. So welcome. I'm sure it's much warmer in Singapore than it is in Dunedin at the moment. So Quaker from Singapore has asked that the background of your previous books all happen in Glasgow. Will you be writing a new book that focuses on New Zealand rather than Scotland?
Yes. Well, that's quite a timely question. In fact, just last week, I began a novel set in Dunedin, which is something that I have resisted, partly through a sense that I, hadn't lived in New Zealand long enough to have a sense of how to write about the place. So I guess I've been in Dunedin for nearly 12 years now. So I suppose suddenly I now feel, okay, I've been here for 12 years, I've got some sort of grasp of how to write about this city. So I have just started. I've written a couple of thousand words of a novel based in Dunedin, which is great fun, and it's also very convenient because, of course, one of the problems of writing about Glasgow from 12,000 miles away is that you spend quite a lot of time on Google Maps, looking at the locations that you're writing about. And Google Maps can only take you so far. You really want the sort of textures and the smells and the kind of essence of physically being in a place. So of course I'm finding that great fun, sort of scouting locations, if you like, for this Dunedin book, and being able to simply stroll down to whichever location it might happen to be. So that will be a bit of a departure for me, and we'll see whether it's successful or not. One of the things that gives me hope is the sort of great strength of New Zealand crime writing at the moment, not least in this city, with people like Van de Simon, Paddy Richardson, Finn Bell, and so on. There's a real nucleus of crime writers in this city. And I think if you look at the amazing success that Van de Simon has recently enjoyed in the UK, where Orenda Publishing have reissued all of Vanda's books, and also they've asked her to revise the books, not to tone down the New Zealand content, but in fact to amplify that, to bring in more references to, I don't know, pineapple lumps or Tim Tams or whatever it may be, again, to give that sense of the authentic sort of Kiwi location. So, I mean, I think it's an auspicious time for New Zealand crime fiction. So hopefully I can ride a wee bit of that wave with a book set in New Zealand. A great question.
Thanks for that. I'm sure there's many of our attendees who are very happy to know that there's something being based in the area that they studied or maybe live in. So thank you for that, Liam. The next question we've got is from Craig. It's a bit more of a logistical and technical one, and he'd like you to describe what your writing day looks like.
Right. Well, I suppose the first thing, Craig, is that I try to write in the mornings. So, of course, I have a sort of bifurcated existence as, on the one hand, an academic professor of Scottish studies focusing on literature, and on the other hand, a creative writer. And they are quite different. I do find that they use quite different, parts of your mind, if you like. And even physically in my office in the Centre for Irish and Scottish Studies, I have two desks. I have a desk where I do my academic stuff, and then I kind of turn around and in a slightly different physical location do my creative writing. But I find that the creative writing takes more out of me in terms of mental energy. So I try to do that in the mornings. So I suppose my typical day would be, I would try to start quite early. I would have a notional word count. I would try as an absolute minimum to do my Graham Greene 500 words. But I would hope, usually I sort of hit around 700, 750, which actually, if you're able to do that regularly, you can build up an 80,000 word novel relatively quickly. I've never actually done that, but you can do that. And then I suppose I would do my sort of academic work in the afternoons. I would, if you're interested in the actual kind of process, I would try and write in longhand in notebooks first, and then sort of transcribe that and edit as I go onto the computer. And I find the process of writing in longhand, it slows you down sufficiently. I feel like I write too fast. If I'm writing in the computer, I can almost write faster than I need to. I want to sort of slow down and try and arrange my sentences the way I would like. And I find that easier to do writing longhand. Writing longhand with a Quaker Sport fountain pen on 90 MSG Japanese Life notebooks, Craig, if you want the actual technical specifications.
Thank you for that detail. I think there's something interesting about the fact that that creative notion comes easily from the brain to that physical movement of writing and not the tapping that we all associate with work. So I think that's a really interesting point. I agree that it certainly would seem to make sense to me to write in longhand. Karen wants to know if you've got any hope, or is there any notion that this novel will be made into a TV series or film? She said that she found the novel wonderfully visual and spatial and very vivid in her mind's eye as she read it. So I think she would be quite hopeful that she might be able to watch it on the big screen. Any plans for that?
Yes, again, good question, Karen. And I suppose I have always, tried to write with, not necessarily with that in mind, but, I am quite a visual writer. So in fact, the book was optioned for TV. So we had a choice. In fact, there were two companies in for it. One was World Productions, who make Line of Duty, the great cop show in the UK. And the other was Left Bank, who do The Crown. So it was a fantastic choice and very exciting. Of course, I knew at the time that whichever one I picked, I would subsequently think, I should have gone with the other one, because these things never get made. So I was quite excited. We went with World Productions, who do Line of Duty, because they had drawn up a very convincing treatment of how they would deal with the material, and of course, I think the option runs for 18 months, and I think they tried a couple of places to get it made, couldn't come up with the funding, so it lapsed. So I think that's kind of par for the course. My mate Colin Gavigan, the professor of law and emerging technologies at Otago, is very friendly with the writer whose name escapes me, who wrote Altered Carbon, which became an HBO, I think, series. And that apparently the work was being optioned every 18 months for about 20 years before it was finally made into a series. So I think I don't really hold out much hope, but I think if it does, very often it takes a long time. So it's one of these things, I guess you just sort of keep the head down and keep writing the books. And if that happens, it would be a fantastic bonus, but it's not really worth expending much mental energy kind of hoping that it will, because the odds are very heavily stacked against it, Karen.
Thank you. I think for the lovers of the book, having it recreated on the screen is a double-edged sword, because what you've got in your mind's eye then gets transformed into someone else's view of what it should be, and it doesn't always work for a reader, does it?
Yeah, but of course, I can't remember which writer it was who was asked, what do you think about what they've done to your book? And his response was, well, they haven't done anything to the book. There's the book still sitting on the shelf. And I'm very much of that viewpoint, that, whatever happens with the TV version, the book still retains its integrity.
Thanks. Pat asks another question, and she tells us that she finds serial killers fascinating, like watching a venomous snake observed, but not too closely. do you have a generic theory of what creates a person who can then become a recurrent killer like this? And would you need a theory to be able to write about them?
Well, again, that's an interesting question, Pat. I actually wrote the Quaker without much, I mean, I was focused very particularly on the specific case of the Bible John murders. So I hadn't really read much in the way of, wider reading around serial killers. Funnily enough, I actually have done quite a lot of that reading in the time since finishing the Quaker. So I've been reading my way through John Douglas, the FBI profiler who Jack Crawford in The Silence of the Lambs is based on. I read his book Mindhunter recently, which is of course the Netflix series is based on. And I have found myself, reading Anne Rule's great book about Ted Bundy, and you're right, there is something, much as you would like to maintain a kind of dignified distance from those individuals, there is something absolutely absorbing. And I think it is the contrast between how you expect someone who's capable of the kind of horrific acts that these serial killers perpetrate. You kind of instinctively imagine that there's, some sort of rabid, raging beast. Whereas, of course, many of them, like Ted Bundy, are utterly charming in real life. There seems to be a complete disconnect, in other words, between the way these individuals project themselves socially and the actual reality of their nature. And I think that's always fascinating in fiction and in crime fiction, that in a sense, the reveal in crime fiction is very important when you actually expose the kind of Poirot Explains chapter at the end of Agatha Christie novels, where the least likely candidate is suddenly identified as the killer. And that's irresistible in crime fiction. I think that's another reason why serial killers are so fascinating. So, I mean, in terms of what makes a serial killer, yeah, I guess, if you read John Douglas's Mindhunter, you'll have a pretty extensive checklist part of those characteristics.
Right. I think Adrian's question follows on from that. So she asks whether you shape your characters based off snippets from people you know, from perhaps the way they might say something or how they walk or a particular item a person was wearing that you may remember. And are you always looking for aspects to include in future characters, or do you just try and keep them independent from your own life? And so there's quite a few questions in here. And how real do you make them in your mind outside what is written in the novel?
Who was that question from, Donella?
Sorry, Adrian.
Adrian. That's a great question, Adrian. I suppose characters are always an amalgam of traits from people that you know, and also from characters that you've read in books. So I mean, one of my all-time favourite novels is Graham Greene's The Quiet American. And that novel features a relationship between a kind of jaded, older journalist and a kind of dangerously idealistic younger man. And for some reason, that relationship features in everything I write. I sometimes feel that I'm just sort of rewriting Graham Greene's The Quiet American with everything that I write. So, don't underestimate the importance of literary characters in how you create a character. Inevitably, of course, you take physical traits or little tics of character from people that you know, and even names. So that can be quite interesting when you realise that you're meeting someone, an old friend, and they say, well, why have you used my name for this horrendous murderer in your novel? And you've got to kind of backtrack. I suppose the other thing I try to do with characters is sort of not get too bound up with trying to know everything about them. some writers advocate sort of keeping folders about characters and knowing, you know, what happened to them in, you know, primary school and what their favourite colour is, or whatever it might be. I don't think that's particularly important. I tend to agree with David Mamet, the American dramatist, who says that character is action. You know, you find out who your character is by what they do. So your task as a novelist is to create interesting dilemmas for a character that kind of force them to choose a particular path or another. And in that choice, that sort of reveals their character. So rather than trying to compile a sense of personality traits and then illustrate those with the action, very often if you create a character, even quite a sketchy character, and give them a compelling dilemma, you then start to find out, along with the reader almost, who this character is. But you're right, that question of finding the sort of telling detail is absolutely crucial. I'm reading at the moment Michael Connelly, who to my mind is the finest crime writer alive. I'm reading a book of his crime journalism. He was a crime reporter before he became a novelist. And one of the things he says is just watching detectives at work and finding the telling detail. Like he was watching one particular homicide detective who, whenever he was confronted with a particularly gruesome murder scene, would remove his spectacles and sort of put the leg of the spectacles in his mouth. And he noticed that he had chewed a deep groove in the leg of his spectacles. And that's the novelistic detail. You don't need to say that this is a character who feels a lot of stress and pressure in the job he's doing. There's a groove in his spectacles made by his teeth. That does the job for you. So it's those little details that you're searching for.
Great question. Thanks, Adrian, and Liam, thanks for the answer. Judith would like to know, how did you get the internal knowledge of how the police work?
Yes, again, very good question, Judith. So I think that is really important in crime fiction. One of the things that you learn as a crime writer is that, you know, crime readers are very exacting. And they really do demand authenticity, you know, wherever possible. And they will write to tell you if you get, you know, the specs of a gun or something that you regard as quite trivial wrong. They will write and tell you. So I think it is important to get that stuff correct as far as you can. I'm fortunate that my cousin is a retired firearms instructor for Strathclyde Police. So my cousin Davy joined what was then the City of Glasgow Police in 1975 when he was 17. And in Scotland, you do 30 years as a cop and you're finished. That's you're out. So he retired at the age of 47 on a full police pension with not really much to do with his time, which was a great boon to me because I would then, and also the time difference worked brilliantly for this. I would, before I went to bed in New Zealand, I would say, Davy, how does this work? Send him a question. And then I would wake up in the morning and Davy would have written 3,000 words complete with photos and hyperlinks. And, you know, I think he should almost have been co-credited with the book. And he was also, you know, in one of the books, I changed the scenario for sort of dramatic effect. And I was, when it came to write the acknowledgements, I said, you know, I'm going to include you in the acknowledgements. And he said, well, actually, if you could leave me out of the acknowledgements, that would be great. I said, you know, why? And he said, well, in this particular scenario, that would never happen. And I don't want my mates in the force thinking that I had okayed, you know. So sometimes that can be a bit of a double-edged sword. For the Quaker, which of course is set in 1969, Davy put me in touch with two homicide detectives in Glasgow who hadn't actually worked the Bible John inquiry, but they had been in the CID around that time, so they knew the procedures. And let's say that these two gentlemen rued the day that they gave me their email addresses because I sort of mercilessly plagued them for details. But I think that, you know, you can glean quite a lot of information from research and from books, but there's nothing to beat being able to just think, right, I've got a particular scenario, I can email this guy and get it from the horse's mouth. So if you can at all, if it's at all possible to get a real live contact who doesn't mind being badgered by inane questions about procedure, then that's great.
Thanks. It's great to hear that level of authenticity and reality in what you've been writing. I'm sure the readers will be very pleased to read that. Though for those attendees who are on, we've got a few more minutes, so please feel free to put your questions in. We have got some more questions here, and Pat asks, was writing a success for you right from the beginning, or are there earlier false?
Well, and I haven't written novels that weren't published. I may have written novels that shouldn't have been published, Pat, but no, I don't have six novels in a drawer as I was trying to sort of aspire to publication. I think partly the reason for that is that I was quite old when I was 40 when my first novel was published, and I also revise very thoroughly as I go. So I'm not the kind of writer who can sort of batter through and get a rough draft and then bring it into shape. I try to polish things up as I go, which is quite a slow process, but I think you probably emerge with a more obviously publishable work at the end of that sort of process. So I didn't have a kind of long apprenticeship of struggling to be a writer. In fact, it kind of happened completely by accident. I had written a chapter in an academic book about contemporary British fiction that was being launched. The book was being launched in London, and I happened to be in London visiting my sister, who at the time was living in Hampstead. So I rocked up to this party, and I met a guy called Lee Blackstone from Faber and Faber, who knew my literary journalism. I'd written quite a lot of reviews for the Times Literary Supplement and the London Review of Books and so on. And I was chatting to him at this party, and he said, do you write fiction? Have you got anything you could show me? So in that moment, I decided that the best course of action would be to lie through my teeth and say, yes, I do. So I then went back home, back up to Aberdeen, and wrote 6,000 words in a kind of frantic flurry and sent them to him, and it kind of snowballed from there. So if I'd never bumped into Lee Blackstone at the only London literary party I have ever attended, I probably wouldn't have started writing novels. So it was quite fortuitous.
It's wonderful to hear that part of your success is due to serendipity. It's a nice twist to the story. Liam, is crime fiction your favourite genre to read, or do you have another genre that you prefer to read yourself other than what you read?
Yes, I suppose I do read a lot of crime fiction, as you would imagine, both because I enjoy it and to keep up with what's happening in the genre, and basically to find things that you can use in your own books. I also read an awful lot of poetry. Poetry is something that's possibly what I enjoy reading most, and I also find that it works very well in conjunction with crime fiction, which might seem a kind of curious thing to say, but I do find that I tend to read poetry before I actually sit down to write my crime fiction. So I kind of prime my writing brain, if you like, by maybe reading some, I don't know, Paul Muldoon or Seamus Heaney or Leontia Flynn, and then sort of sit down to write my crime fiction. I also read a lot of literary fiction, which most crime writers do. And one of the interesting things, I think, is that that sense of a big divide between genre fiction, your crime fiction, and literary fiction, is not something that most crime writers recognise. Most of the crime writers I know, people like Val McDermid or Adrian McKenty or Steve Kavanagh, read a lot of crime fiction. They read a lot of literary fiction. Val McDermid was a judge for the Booker Prize. Lee Child was a judge for the Booker Prize. But very often in the other direction, writers who only write literary fiction will feel entitled to dismiss the entire genre of crime fiction as kind of beneath their notice, which I think both infuriates and kind of amuses crime writers.
Thanks for that, Liam. I have a question that I want to bring back to the beginning, and you talked about the ethical issues about writing a topic that had happened and how you changed things to move away from that. Have you had any feedback from any of the families who were actually involved in the original murders?
No, this was a question that Steve Bronius, in fact, asked me at the Dunedin Writers' Festival a couple of years ago. And I suppose you might argue that it was incumbent on me to contact the families in advance. I suppose I took the view that I would try to treat the material as ethically as I could, but I would also recognise that in some respects the Bible John killings have become part of the social history of the place in which I grew up. You know, the west of Scotland is, you know, there's kind of no escape in some respects from the Bible John murders. So in that sense, they've kind of passed into a sort of communal ownership that writing about the Bible John murders, you know, is to some extent writing about how the west of Scotland came to be the kind of community that I experienced when I grew up. But I would be, I mean, I'd be, you know, I think it's perfectly legitimate for people to question the morality of that. I think just with crime fiction, that's just always a line that you have to tread, and you have to try and tread it to the best of your abilities. But you also have to be open to people who perhaps think that you didn't get everything right, and that you perhaps, you know, might have been more sensitive in your treatment of a particular area. So I think, you know, I try to be quite open to criticism on that score. The other thing, of course, with this book is the title, which again was not my title. It was the title that was chosen by my editor. But that has caused me, I wouldn't say grief, but, you know, the Society of Friends, to some extent quite legitimately, you know, miffed that I've chosen to besmirch their denomination with the title of the book. But again, in my defence, I would argue that the Quaker is presented very much in the novel as a tabloid nickname coined by a journalist, not something that you know, should carry any more weight than that. But that has led to some interesting conversations.
Well, thanks, Liam. I see that we've come to the end of time, really. I want to be respectful of everyone's evenings and parts of the day that you may be in, wherever you are in the world. But I'd like to extend a huge thank you to you, Liam. It's been a fascinating insight into not only your process in writing and your research, but also your thought processes that you go through to develop and create the stories that so many people around the world have loved. And it's nice for us to have a wee insight to hear that, yes, maybe there's a TV series coming, and yes, maybe there's a story about Dunedin coming. So thank you for sharing those little bits of insight with us.
Not at all. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Sorry, if I could just say, Danielle, you know, thanks so much for hosting this. And I'm deeply grateful to all of the participants who have tuned in and listened to me banging on for so long. But the questions were terrific, and hopefully I've thrown some light on the writing process. Thanks very much.
You're welcome. And thank you to our participants. I can say that I've been watching and without a word of a lie, all participants have stayed on right to the very end of tonight. They're still there, and that is unheard of in a webinar. So well done, Liam. To our participants, if you have any burning questions which you think of once we leave, please feel free to email them to us, and I'll pass them on to Liam, and hopefully he will find some time to answer those at a later date. But once again, thank you everybody so much for joining with us. If you have any feedback about our book club, feel free to pass it on. We would hope to continue that with the book club again next year. It's been a good success, and given the fact that meeting in person is a little bit difficult at the moment, we see this as a good way of keeping engaged with some of our members of our alumni. So thank you to everyone. Warm thanks to Liam, and I wish you all a very good evening or good day, depending on what time of the time zone you're in. And we look forward to seeing you again soon. Bye, everyone.